There is a food that grows without fertilizer. And no, it doesn't need nitrogen inputs, soil treatment between seasons, or external support to maintain yield. You're probably thinking it would be depleting the land. But no, it actually does the opposite. It rebuilds it. Fields that stop producing can recover after a single cycle of this crop. Yields increase, soil structure improves, and fertility returns. For thousands of years, this wasn't an alternative. It was a system. Entire agricultural regions depended on it to stay productive, without external inputs. Then, within a few decades, it disappeared from large-scale use. Not because it stopped working, but because it made something else unnecessary. And once that happened, it slowly lost the place it once held. In most food systems, something has to be added back. Every harvest takes something. Nutrients leave the soil with every crop. Over time, the system begins to rely on replacement. That replacement mostly comes from fertilizers. Without them, output declines. So fertilizers are added season after season, and the cycle repeats. Each season begins by restoring what the last one removed. That creates a pattern. Production depends on a continuous supply. Remove that supply, and the system slows. But what if a crop didn't need those inputs at all? There is a crop that doesn't begin by taking. It changes how the field behaves from the start. As it grows, something unusual happens. Instead of only using what's already there, it adds back what other crops remove. The field isn't just producing, it's adjusting itself while it produces. That distinction is easy to miss, but it changes the crop's role entirely. It turns restoration from a later activity into one that happens during growth. If a system can produce food while maintaining itself, then the need to keep supplying it begins to disappear. And when that need disappears, something else follows. The dependency weakens. The cycle of input and replacement begins to break. What remains is not just a better crop, but a different way for a field to sustain itself. By now, you might be wondering what this crop actually is. It is legumes, not a single plant, but an entire category. Beans, lentils, chickpeas, and peas. They appear ordinary. They are sold as food, grouped with staples, and valued mainly for protein. But what makes legumes different is not what you see above the ground. It is what they are doing below it. As they grow, small nodules begin to form along their roots. Inside those nodules live bacteria that serve a specific role. They take nitrogen from the air and convert it into a form plants can use. This process is integrated into the plant's growth. In most systems, nitrogen must be supplied through fertilizers, inputs that have to be produced, transported, and applied. Legumes bypass that step entirely. They do not wait for nitrogen to be added. They generate it themselves, and not just enough for their own growth. As they grow, excess nitrogen enters the surrounding soil, changing the conditions for whatever grows next. The field is no longer dependent on what was already there. It is being nourished during production. Legumes do not just grow in the field. They are actively reshaping it while they grow. That shifts their role completely. They are no longer just a crop within the cycle. They become part of what makes the cycle possible. They do not just produce food. They carry a function that other crops depend on to begin. Once that difference exists, everything planted after legumes starts from a different condition than before. Once that mechanism is in place, legumes begin to change what the field actually is. It is no longer just a surface that supports growth. It becomes part of a cycle that maintains itself. In most systems, crops are grown in isolation. One season produces, and the next season repairs. Fertility is treated as something separate from production. Legumes remove that separation. They are planted not only for what they yield, but for what they leave behind. And what they leave is not neutral. It changes the starting condition for everything that follows. The soil already has nitrogen. The next crop does not have to begin from zero. The field does not need to reset before it can produce again. If legumes can build fertility while the field is still producing, then the entire idea of preparing the field before each season begins to collapse. When that happens, time opens up. Labor shifts away from restoring what was lost. Costs tied to inputs begin to fall. Production no longer pauses to recover. More land becomes usable without heavy preparation. Yields stabilize because the starting condition no longer resets. Fewer inputs, fewer interruptions. Fields that continue because legumes allow them to. Once legumes were understood, they did not remain local. They appeared across regions that had no contact with each other. Different climates, different crops, different cultures. But legumes kept showing up in the same role. In parts of South America, beans were grown alongside maize. The two were not separated. Legumes were placed there deliberately because of what they did to the soil. In Asia, farmers built legumes into rotations that restored fertility before it declined. In Africa, legumes were used to reclaim land that could no longer produce. These were not isolated techniques. Using legumes became part of everyday farming, not as optimization, but as a baseline. Think about it. If legumes appear across continents, across centuries, without coordination, then they are not a technique. They are a pattern. Patterns like that do not spread by accident. They persist because they solve a constraint. Soil fertility has always been a limiting factor. Legumes address that limit from within the field itself. No centralized production, no external supply chains, no need to bring fertility from somewhere else. Knowledge moved with people, adapted to local conditions, and followed wherever legumes could grow. It did not require infrastructure to scale. It required understanding of what legumes were already doing. And once established, legumes remained part of the field, not because they were enforced, but because they kept working consistently over time. For a long time, legumes held a fixed place in the field. They were not rotated in and out based on preference. They were included because without them, the ground would eventually lose its ability to produce. Beans, lentils, and peas were part of how the land stayed usable. Remove them, and something had to take their place. That shift did not happen all at once. It began when another option appeared, a way to support crops without needing legumes in the cycle. That option came in the form of fertilizers, not by improving what legumes did, but by bypassing them entirely. The moment farmers realized they could grow crops without first planting legumes, the reason to keep planting them began to disappear. From that point, their role started to change. They were no longer the step that made everything else possible. They became one choice among many. Planting sequences shortened and rotations simplified. The land could be pushed further, season after season, without waiting. Legumes still enriched the soil. They still supported what came next. But the system around them no longer required that function. And once something is no longer required, it begins to lose its place, not immediately, but gradually. By the time that shift was complete, legumes had not disappeared. They had been moved out of the role they were once essential for. What replaced legumes wasn't a crop. It didn't grow in fields. It didn't take months to produce. It arrived ready to be used. Fertilizer replaced legumes. At first, it appeared as a solution. Nitrogen could be applied to the soil in controlled amounts at any point in the season. It was a way to supply what legumes had always provided, without waiting for a full growing cycle. No planting, sequencing, or timing required. The moment nitrogen could be applied instantly, time replaced biology. This changed how decisions were made. Instead of planning around what the soil needed next, farmers could focus on what they wanted to grow now. And what they wanted to grow now was whatever could yield maximum profits. Once again, as has happened many times in human history, the lure of profits decided the next crop. Legumes worked over time. Fertilizers worked on demand. The difference might seem small, but it reshaped priorities. Crops that generated immediate returns became easier to repeat. Fields no longer had to pause for recovery. Production could continue without interruption. Legumes began to feel like primitive technology. Their benefit was delayed, carried forward into the next cycle. Fertilizers delivered results within the same season. Faster, more predictable, easier to standardize. With fertilizers widely available, fields were designed for immediate output, and inputs were applied to maintain it. The role legumes once played became harder to justify within that structure. Legumes did not disappear entirely. Beans, lentils, and peas are still grown across the world. Still eaten, still traded, still part of daily diets. Their role has narrowed. They are treated as food, not as part of the system that once kept fields productive. And yet, nothing about how they work has changed. They still fix nitrogen. They still enrich the soil as they grow. They still prepare the ground for what comes next. It was human decisions that changed their role. What replaced them solved one part of the problem. Fertilizers made nitrogen available on demand, but there were trade-offs applied repeatedly. They can disrupt soil balance. Over time, soil structure weakens. Nutrients become less stable. More input is required to maintain the same output. Excess does not stay in the field. It moves into water systems, into surrounding ecosystems, creating problems that did not exist when fertility was generated within the cycle itself. Legumes work differently. They do not flood the soil with nutrients. They introduce them gradually, in balance with growth. They do not require repeated application. They operate as part of the process. That difference still exists today, but the system no longer depends on it. Which leaves a question that has not changed. If a crop can produce food while maintaining the soil, why was it ever moved out of that role? Greed might be the right answer. Legumes did not lose their ability to nourish the soil and grow without fertilizer. What changed was the role they were allowed to play. A crop that could maintain fertility from within the field was replaced by something that could deliver it from outside. It was not because it worked better. It was because it worked faster, and it fit the direction things were moving. Legumes are still here, still doing the same thing they always have. Which leaves a simple question. How many solutions are overlooked, not because they fail, but because they remove the need for what replaced them? If you found this fascinating, hit subscribe for more stories like this one.